my name is Lalitha, as Jane introduced, and I am so pleased to be here, having a conversation with a really wonderful group of people. And it's my charge to moderate a discussion about media literacy. And we, all six of us, had a conversation about a week and a half ago, just to kind of set the tone, figure out where each other's coming from. And one of the things we realized was that not only are there really strong commonalities across the way we're thinking about media literacy, but really important and complementary ways that we are trying to enter into that conversation, expand the conversation, and interrupt what's happening in this country and beyond in terms of the way that people become literate about the world and the role that media can play in that endeavor. And so just by way of starting out, I wanted to give everybody a chance to kind of engage with a very simple question. And one of the things I will do before that is you're going to see some slides. They're not necessarily going to correspond one-to-one to what people are saying. That can be very annoying as an audience member. But they're meant to provide, shall we say, scenery. But they're substantive scenery, and at the bottom right of every slide, you see a URL. And if you go to that URL, there's a very simple question for you to answer. What does media literacy mean to you? And throughout our conversation today, we're going to hear what people have to say. You can just jot down a few thoughts, and we'll see what the cloud looks like near the end of our panel. And we want to provide ample time for all of you to engage this panel with questions as well. So throughout this conversation, occasionally I'll push some buttons. So I wanted to invite our panelists to engage with this question, and that is the phrase media literacy. What is that? What should we be thinking about when we imagine the words media literacy?
I'm happy to start. Not surprising. Hi, I'm Michelle. So I can tell you how my organization, the National Association for Media Literacy Education, we call ourselves NAMELY, so I'll refer to us as that from now on. So NAMELY defines media literacy as the ability to access, analyze, evaluate, create, and act using all forms of communication. So the way that we think about media literacy, it's an expanded definition of literacy. And really what we're looking at is, what does it mean to be a literate citizen in today's world? And our framing is that, you can't be truly literate today unless you really truly understand all forms of communication.
Sure, I would say, hi, I'm Ioana. I would say for me, also the creative part is important as well. So I think that's also the NAMELY definition is not only the ability to consume, but also to create media effectively, powerfully, meaningfully, because we are in, and I hate that term, the Web 2.0 era. I don't think we're in the Web 2.0 era anymore. Yes, we're in a new era where really the ability to create media and engage in meaningful dialogues with and through media is at our fingertips. And I think that's a very important part of the conversation too.
I look at media literacy from the educational rights-based perspective. So at our center, we're very much interested in what frames students' educational rights, and in the United States, in most states, it's the state constitution. In New York State, the state constitutional right to education is defined in terms of preparation for civic participation, and it's become more and more clear what an important role media literacy plays in being prepared for civic participation. So that's our entry point into this work.
Shall I take over? And then Emily. So I come more from the design background, looking at the interaction between design and learning and human behavior. So I would like to include some concepts around like design literacy, understanding what the implication of the design is in my action, how we think and how we behave, and what implication it has on other people's media literacy and consumption as well. Information literacy that has transformed somewhat from what traditionally was considered information literacy, because now that with all the data being used to understand us and work towards or sometimes against us, I think that's another layer of information literacy that we should also be considerate of.
Just to really echo Michelle and Ioana, I think that's kind of where I come into media literacy is really this focus on reframing what we think of as literacy practices and thinking of literacies as being not a singular literacy, but thinking about multiple literacies and how they all intersect and how they're all very not only prevalent but important for us to be becoming proficient in as adults, but also for young people. And I think really the emphasis on production, so not just focusing on how young people are consuming the media, but how they're creating media. And so needing to focus on critical thinking skills and critical making skills is really kind of the entry point that I come into media literacy at.
So one of the things that has come up in our conversations and all of the really wonderful work each of you is doing are a couple of tensions. And I want to invite you all to engage with this. And one of the things we promised we wouldn't do, but we did want to do that, just to give you a starting point for where the different panelists are coming into this. I'm going to be kind of a nudge of a moderator and sometimes invite people to kind of move from one topic to another just so we can get the fullest range of perspectives. And one of the things that has come up in some of the pre-conversation we had has to do with both who is the audience for this kind of work, what should the ends of media literacy be, but also what should the process of media literacy be? What are the curricular implications of orienting ourselves as media literacy educators, media literacy researchers, media literate policymakers? And so maybe we can start, Michelle, I know namely is really committed to the cause of media literacy for all. Can you say a little bit about for whom media literacy ought to be a goal? And we'll start with that.
So short answer is everyone. I'll start there. Certainly media literacy are skills that need to be built from the youngest to the oldest learners in both formal and informal education spaces. It used to be that media literacy was something that was really focused in higher education. And then we realized that was too late in the game, so we should really bring it to high school. And then we realized, that's a little too late in the game. We need to bring it to middle school. And I can say that I just spent 2 days this week in Chicago building a framework for 0 to 8-year-olds and media literacy. So there's no minimum age anymore, right? Kids needed visual literacy, media literacy skills from the very beginning of their lives. And certainly as technology and media continue to change, we need to think of it as lifelong learning. Certainly in this space, in the media literacy space, we spend a lot of time, my organization, in the formal education space. And we see it happening from pre-K to 12. We see it happening at higher ed, but we also do see it happening in communities. And specifically, I think about community like public libraries or museums, PBS education, community media, so it is happening in a lot of different spaces, but it is by no means happening nationwide. And that's one of the things that as an organization we're thinking about, and really how do you scale it from, throughout the formal education. I don't know if that answers your question, but.
You're going to find that everything answers my question.
Okay, great. Thank you. Glad I'm here.
So I want to also not shut down other people who might want to respond to Michelle, but I will throw another additional question out there, and that has to specifically do, Jessica, with the work that you all are doing through CEE, and that has to do with the intentional tie that you're making between media literacy and civic engagement. And I know some of the work that Ioana and Yoo Kyung are working on as well has some resonances with, if Michelle's call to action is everyone ought to be media literate and we need to start at 0, then how are we actually trying to do it? And what are the kind of tethered concepts that resonate with it? And civic engagement certainly was one that came up in a lot of our conversation that we had. So Jessica, did you want to?
So I guess we started looking into this as part of our work, convening a new New York statewide coalition called Democracy Ready New York. And the goal of the coalition is to prepare all students for civic participation, which is their constitutional right, as I said before. I think there's a pretty broad consensus, both in the research and among teachers and practitioners, about the importance of media literacy as an element of preparation for civic participation. And it certainly was the coalition's first policy area that they all wanted to pursue as a group. So when I think about it as part of the right to education, I'm thinking about how can we use education policy and practice to make sure that it's something that students have access to in every school, and not just in schools where the faculty happen to value it or the community thinks it's important.
Now, I know you all are engaging with this, trying to find other partners.
Well, I will let my colleague Yoo Kyung Chang also weigh in, but we are working at MassLab, the Media and Social Change Lab, that is very well represented on this panel, so I'm very happy about that. We're working on fake news game. We're really working on a better title. A fake news game for middle school students. And before I really delve into talking about it, I do want to just mention that, and we've talked about this on our call, that, I'll talk to you about fake news, but media literacy is very much more than fake news. That fake news is. So we will definitely delve deeper into that. But to preface what I'm going to say is that fake news is shining a much needed spotlight on media literacy, but media literacy goes way beyond fake news, and those two are not interchangeable in any ways. But so we're developing, so far it's a card game aimed at middle school students that is based on empirical research about fake news and misinformation, and especially how young people engage and make sense of fake news and misinformation online, because that's really where they get their news from. They get their news from social media, they get their news in video form. They don't get their news in the way that maybe we think they're getting their news. And actually we've been really engaging young people in co-designing this game with us and thinking with us about ways to best reach them in regards to fake news. Because really, the way to reach them is to emphasize their agency in the process, and to really invite them, as we've said, to take a seat at the design table. As co-creators and not only of consumers of educational experiences around fake news. And I'll stop here to see if Yoo Kyung has anything else to add. And then I'll also tell you a little bit about how my own research is enabling me to think about these questions.
Well, I think you want to cover most of the things that I would like to share. But I think one of the interesting things about working with youth is that when we interact with them, they have a very firm belief about and confidence about their news literacy. And it's not only about just identifying fake news, but about their just general literacy. And sometimes I think that there comes a confusion when we look at youth, and adults often look at youth and their technical literacy and confuse that with the media literacy. And I think that's another level of sort of like a design literacy that I would like to sort of highlight.
Can I offer a kind of a scale out comment? So I served as a media literacy curriculum consultant for 3 years in the Bronx and Brooklyn up until about a year and a half ago, when I was in the thick of dissertation writing and having a baby. So I haven't been in that space for about a year and a half, but I think going back to Lalitha's original question of kind of like these tensions that exist and what we're kind of up against in terms of formal school spaces and settings, and something that I have just witnessed, and correct me if I'm outdated in this perspective, but I think some of the tensions that exist are really around, one of the prongs is like the argument for having a specific media literacy class designated in a K-12 or high school curriculum, versus fully integrating media literacy throughout the core subjects. And I was very much of the first school of thought for a long time. I thought there should be a specific media literacy class, and part of me still does, because I love media literacy so much, and I think it's so interesting to engage young people with popular culture and texts and other forms of media that they're so interested in, but then, working on these critical skills and tools. And at the same time, I think we're, being in these school spaces, I think we're doing a disservice to young people, to media literacy, and to the rest of the curriculum if we're not, I think, making the core curriculum more engaging by bringing media literacy practices and concepts in and texts. But I think it also tends to be siloed and thought that media literacy can only be brought into a social studies classroom or an English language an ELA classroom. And I think that's not true. And I think, what some of the women are going to talk about today, in terms of STEM, in terms of science spaces, in terms of math spaces. I just think it's important and it's exciting that this work is kind of happening. And then really quickly, just going back to what Michelle was saying, I think we often see, kind of as a result of that, we see media literacy happening more, I don't even want to say more successfully, but maybe more in out of school spaces or after school spaces, because there just isn't the time and isn't the space often to be doing media literacy well and integrating it well. That's not to say it's not happening, but I think oftentimes we're seeing organizations that partner with schools to be doing these trainings with teachers and be integrating it, just because I think time is and curricular constraints are really big challenges to this work.
Can I make a point about civic engagement? So there's a slide that, the purpose of media literacy slide. So I think it's important, keep going. Next one. Okay, so this usually gets married to when I talk about the definition. So if you think about the purpose of media literacy education, and you go to the kind of second part of this, where we're looking at critical thinking, effective communicating, and then this idea of being an active citizen in today's world, I think that speaks to how we see the integration or the overlap between civic engagement and media literacy, that for us, like the purpose of media literacy education, those three things are all as important as the other, that there is a creation element, there is an acting element that must happen in order for people to be fully media literate. So we see civic engagement and media literacy linked in a really, really big way. And we're doing a lot of work with the civic engagement and civics folks in the country, because I think we're all starting to realize how those are linked.
I think it's great that you and Jessica are sitting together, and hopefully this will be the start of
we've already talked.
Yes. In fact, I was going to mention one of the early pieces of one of our early conversations. But so I have two things to talk about in terms of these tensions. One is one of the first things that this Democracy Ready Coalition asked when they were looking at media literacy is media literacy for civic preparation, is that a subset of media literacy, or is all of media literacy relevant to preparing students for civic participation? And that was one of the first questions I asked Michelle to weigh in on. You said, I'm not a researcher, but... And then
I usually start all of my talks that way. That's a disclaimer.
So I was happy that Michelle validated my sense of the issue, which is that that media literacy in the broadest sense is necessary for having students to be prepared for civic participation. And that's ultimately what we worked with at the coalition. But the other thing that the other tension is what we were talking before about whether it's something that should be across the curriculum, a strategy that's used across the curriculum, or whether it should be a course that's taught within the curriculum. And as a group that's really thinking about this from a student's rights perspective, we thought, why not both and? Why not aspire to ensuring that all teachers are media literate and can teach media literacy within their content area, and from 0 to into and through college, but also as an insurance policy, why not try to encourage education officials and policymakers to put a course into, say, the 9th grade curriculum, just in case.
Yeah. Well, I think there's a tension between, is media literacy a what to teach or is it a how to teach? Right. And I definitely as the field, if I can call it a field, has evolved. Yeah. It's definitely evolved into the thinking that it's a how, and that all teachers need that type of training. But I think we all stand in the same place of yes, and that we do want all teachers to have training in this and to really bring media literacy to their classroom, whether it's math or science or social studies, but that it can't hurt to have media literacy courses and focused media studies courses. Certainly can't hurt.
It's interesting. I sometimes think about these ideas as a stance, right? That's something that we embody in the way that we orient ourselves to questions about education. And more broadly, I think one of the things that came up in our conversation was also about the intimate ties between the why we do this to the impact on people's lives. And Emily, you talked in our pre-conversation about the intersections of social justice and anti-racist pedagogy and media literacy. And I know this question of why, in terms of inclusion, inclusivity, democratic participation, it sort of bleeds through all of the work that you all are doing. And I wondered if you could respond, and however you wanted to, just a question of why does this matter to you? Each of you are both educators, researchers. You are informing policy in the little p and big P. Can you say a little bit about why media literacy, both as a how, but also as a where to inhabit, perhaps, matters to you? That's a big one. Go for it. If anybody's ready to give Emily the really big one. Emily, look poised.
Okay. I'll start by talking to you a little bit about how I've embraced the line of inquiry that I'm currently pursuing in my own research. I was always interested in youth online creativity, youth online creative participation. And one could say I was lurking in these spaces of interest, in these online spaces where youth are active socially, culturally. And I noticed that around the 2016 presidential election, these spaces that are non-political spaces were really turning very political in a really organic, grassroots, and meaningful kind of way. That's the places where young people hang out. That's the places where they connect with their peers. And politics is important to them, and it should be important to them. So, of course, they're going to talk about politics, too. And I think for us, maybe that's a bit of a leap to think that they're hanging out on Scratch, where they're supposed to be developing games and animations, and they're actually right, and they're actually talking about the Electoral College. I quote Winston Churchill a lot recently, which might be weird. As Winston Churchill said, never let a good crisis go to waste. So I really took this opportunity to delve deeper into how online participation for young people also functions as political expression, and then how political expression can be turned into civic engagement and political participation, because these are the voters of tomorrow. So I would say that's where I'm coming from. That's the perspective that I'm coming from, in really emphasizing that these conversations are already happening, that media literacy and peer-to-peer media literacy is already happening in online spaces. It's already happening on social media. It's already happening outside the bounds of our family homes and classrooms. And often it's happening in very meaningful ways in these spaces because we care about what our peers think and say and think about politics. And especially, in youth, peer groups are the most influential groups, including in terms of political socialization. So I've been trying to emphasize that these boundaries, if you will, between online and offline, between formal and informal spaces of education are, to youth themselves, rather artificial. And we need to learn from what is happening in these online grassroots spaces. We need to learn from them. We need to listen to them so that we can figure out how to reach them before it's too late. It sounds ominous.
No, it doesn't. And I think one of the things that you've talked about, this panel's talked about, is both the urgency of this moment, however long this moment lasts, hopefully not too much longer, but also the kind of ways in which the proliferation of the opportunity to be media literate and inform the larger media landscape that not only we're consuming, but that other people are consuming, only gets more and more. And so as platforms proliferate, as mobile technology proliferates, as opportunities to enter into spheres of influence proliferates, it feels like it's becoming even more of an onus upon us, those of us who care about this, to enter that conversation thoughtfully.
Yeah, no, the space that I often operate in with media literacy is in regards to popular culture. And I think, I come to media literacy from a very personal place of kind of like what Michelle was saying before of I think, the field realizing that we need to be doing this earlier and earlier. I discovered media literacy in college and was one of those like kids, who was like, I could have used this, 4 years ago. And then I was like, wait a sec, I could have used this as a preteen, just as a girl up against pop culture and, up against particular representations of girls and young women in terms of race, in terms of gender, in terms of class. I didn't know until college that I could ask critical questions of the media and I could push back on the media. And it wasn't until grad school that I was, learning more about the field and realizing that there was this transition happening where it was less about kind of just the consuming and more about, okay, well, what do we make in response now? It's not just about asking the critical questions as kind of a passive consumer. It's, I'm going to be an active creator and create my own media, kind of in response to this. So that's where I come into this. And then my perspective about that has since broadened as well in terms of thinking about, I'm a privileged white woman. And so where do people who have different intersecting identities and positionalities, what's their relationship to the media and what's their relationship to popular culture? And we see this over and over and over again about problematic representations and images and messages. And so I really think media literacy is an emancipatory practice and a liberating or a liberatory practice so for me, that's kind of where media literacy and social justice come together. I think this is absolutely a form of social justice. And I think it's our responsibility, in terms of civic participation, but I think there are injustices being done to young people in the media, and we need to be working with young people on understanding how to critically engage that, but then also, more importantly, kind of push back and speak back and create their own media to challenge that, especially in this age of news and such.
Danny.
Yeah.
So, truthfully, obviously I think about media literacy and advocate for media literacy on a daily basis, but to me, there's truthfully nothing to me that feels more important. And I'm not saying that lightly. I'm not exaggerating. To me, it truly is the most important thing that we are thinking about today, given the impact that media have on our lives. On a personal note, my experience with media literacy came about because it's different scenario, but Emily realizing how badly she could have used media literacy earlier. The truth is that when I was 17, my father was killed in the bombing of Pan Am 103, and that came to us through the screens. So we found out about our father's death through television, and we experienced this personal loss through media. And my entire life, obviously, was changed from that experience and that tragedy, but the role that media played in that played an enormous part of my life. And I am saying this, and I really truly mean it, that my life would have been different if I was media literate when that had happened. If I had had the skills to understand like the images that were coming into my home, the stories that were being told, the way that the narrative was playing out, that was so personal. I didn't know what questions to ask. I didn't know how to be critical. It wasn't something that I was ever taught. And it wasn't until time went on and I realized what questions I should have been asking that I actually found quite a bit out that was quite different from what the news was telling me. So to me, I come at this from an incredibly personal point of view, but I use that personal story as a reminder of how urgent all of this is and how there are kind of people that are experiencing media very personally, you know, whether it's an Instagram post that a 14-year-old girl is seeing or whether it's a news story about a school shooting and someone, you know, it's very personal. Media are very personal and the stories that are being told are very personal. So to me, it's, oh gosh, there's just nothing more important than this. Like, we have to understand this. And I would say that I would just push back that like the political, the spotlight that has been brought up in these issues is like the crisis that we can't let go to waste, but it's never gonna go back. Like, we're never going to go back to a scenario where politicians do not use social media. We're never, it's done. It's not just because President Trump likes to use Twitter. He is open, no matter who it is, that's how we're gonna be getting messages from now on. So we have to be careful, I think, about waiting for a period of time to be over because the game has changed. And we have to kind of be prepared for that. Even if the messages, we might respond differently to the messages, it's changed and we're not going back. You know?
I see we have a question. Can we just wait just a minute? We're going to get to questions. Because I did want to ask one thing to invite a few other perspectives, and that is each of you has chosen a kind of different mode by which to engage. And some of you are engaging in different modes. Jessica, you've been talking about the curricular work and the activism and organizing work that you all are doing. Yoo Kyung and Ioana are working on a game, and that's one of many projects that they're engaged in. Michelle, you just brought up sort of the ways in which news is received, but also the way social life is mediated. And one of the things that's been a particularly compelling kind of artifact in the media in the last few years has been young people's responses to mass shootings, for example. And there's a lot of other examples, but I think about the March for Our Lives movement and what happened when Parkland happened. And not that we've made great changes, but it is worth asking what has changed. And I like the invitation to consider how we can never go back, but that we only continue to have a cumulative experience, right? That we are always the product of what came before, for the better or worse. And so one of the things I wanted to invite you all to think about and respond to is what has been some of the advantages of choosing the particular mode of engagement you've been doing to address this kind of massive problem. And I want to maybe ask Jessica and Yoo Kyung and Ioana to maybe kick that off and just to think about curricularly organizing. You have app development going on through the civic engagement work. You all are doing workshops, teacher development. So do you want to say a little bit about what has been your entry into this?
I guess, I mean, sort of going back to your previous question as well, one of the things, the reason why I got into this topic is when my curiosity when I saw people were so comfortable using or bringing in like Amazon Echo and such into the home. And the idea of privacy, they're very free and comfortable talk about very private things in front of those machines while they would not have done in a public space anywhere else. So I guess the concept of fluidity in the digital and the physical world really is exists for everybody, but I think it's the acknowledgement or not that is different. And one of the ways that I see as a difference between media literate and less literate people nowadays, and those are some of the issues that I'm very interested in looking into. Do you want to take over?
Sure, and I would say, I would say, going back to our fake news game, again, to me, what's really important is the question of agency, which has a lot to do with the issue of listening to young people and really learning from what they're doing and learning how to reach them in their own language. And I think we've been talking a lot about youth. Obviously, it's not just about youth. So again, just something that I want to emphasize. And I love Lalitha's question earlier, for whom, right? It's not a question that we often really stop to think about when we talk about media literacy, but it's a really important question. And of course, different stakeholders or different groups might be reached in different ways. And I think that's, again, a question that research can answer really well. And there's been a lot of research on media literacy education recently, but it strikes me actually how often the voices of young people who this research is really for and about are missing from the conversation. So that's just something that I'm seeing from, I guess, putting on my researcher hat for a minute. That's a huge gap and area of opportunity that I'm seeing. So we shouldn't be talking really about them, that we should be talking with them and really inviting them, like we said before, to the design table.
The coalition that we have formed is intergenerational, so we do have a youth leadership initiative and youth leaders from around the state who are part of this work that we're doing. And I think that, in some ways, we at the Center for Educational Equity, with our rights-based approach and the connection to the right of students to be prepared for civic participation, we wanted to share that as a tool for people who are working in a number of sectors to advance students, the number of people who are active in the civic life. And we found that there are people working on that from academics to educators to youth development people to education advocates to good government groups and participation in democracy groups, and they activist students, but they haven't been working together. So we saw this opportunity in New York State, and with the leverage of the right, as a way of bringing all of these different sectors together, different generations together, different parts of the education spectrum together, to work collectively for collective action.
I forgot the question. I was just listening to these
that's okay.
lovely people speak.
Well, they are, and I think that you can take up the last question, which really had to do with, everybody's engaging in the broader media literacy at issue in different ways, and namely has taken on this work of convening people and doing professional development, doing curriculum development. How do you see that either working, or are there things that you want to do more of?
So I would say, thank you for reminding me. So we are very zoomed out, right? Like we are zoomed out on the whole country, and like what is the practice? What is happening in pre-K to 12 space? What is happening in our higher ed? What are happening in communities? Our 5,400 members, there are members in every single state. There are members that are, teaching third grade in Missouri and assistant professor in Maine. Like everyone who's doing media literacy, every option is kind of within our community. So we're looking very zoomed out. We're looking at practice. We're figuring out who our community is and how can we support that community. So for me, ultimately, to me, my job is a community builder, right? Ultimately, like I am in some ways a community organizer, right? Like I am building the foundation for media literacy educators. I am giving them support. I am giving them access to resources. We're trying to act as a hub. So we aren't necessarily assessing practice. We're not saying this is the way you should be doing it. This is the way you shouldn't be doing it. Although we, obviously we won't let, things that are dangerous go by. We're really focused on building that community and giving educators and organizations supports and making that network really strong around the country.
I'm going to ask Emily to jump in a second. I wondered, just given that, right, that all of the work that you all are doing, I'm thinking back to that moment, Yoo Kyung, you talked about that awareness of people bringing things like Amazon Echoes into their homes, right? We haven't really talked about surveillance and privacy. It's certainly a part of the media literacy conversation, and I wondered if those of you, and Emma, if you want to kick it off, just how do we reconcile both the things you can do now that we have all these affordances with the things we ought to be doing? And who is involved in shaping some of those things, right?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't think I have a fully thought out response to it, but two things that
did not come up in our pre-conversation.
Really threw it in. Sure did. Ringer. No, just two thoughts kind of came to mind when you were saying that, because when Ioana mentioned agency before, which I think is such an important piece of this, and yes, typically or often we're talking about young people in these spaces, and I think it's a dance with young people because they are, I think, engaging in incredibly interesting and multiple literacies practices that are unprecedented, and that I think we're trying to catch up with and learn from them. And at the same time, there is a lot out there that's happening that, I think it's the whole reason we're having this conversation also. It's because young people don't always have all the capacities or the skills or the knowledge that we've been talking about today. And I don't mean to set that up as like a deficit way of thinking about it, but there is a reason that we have teachers and educators and that we're having this conversation. And just, two things that came to mind are both with social media and something that I'm continuously fascinated about, but something I've been thinking about a lot that came up in my dissertation research is around Instagram use, which is a fascinating platform, and I'm just starting to chip away at some of that. But I have young cousins, and also my dissertation participants were in high school, and just the choices or the lack of thinking about, having a public profile versus a private profile. Same goes for Twitter, but I think there's something really interesting about Instagram being such a visual platform. And so thinking about young people making the decision to have a public or private profile, and something I came up against or came up that was introduced to me during dissertation data collection was around young people having multiple Instagram accounts for different purposes. So kind of using one as their kind of goof off, calling it their fake Instagram account, but actually showing more of their real selves in it, but the less perfect curated version of their lives, and then having their real Instagram account, which was kind of portraying or conveying a more perfect, again, curated representation of their everyday lives. So I think that's a piece of it in terms of privacy and in terms of wanting followers and wanting likes and all of that, but a larger conversation about kind of digital footprint. And it's something I'm thinking a lot about with my 1.5-year-old. I'm very consciously not posting photos of her, but I've got a lot of friends, because I'm in that stage of life where a lot of people are having babies and hashtagging their children's names or creating Instagram accounts for their kids with their full names. And it's something I wrestle with a lot, because these kids are already having digital personas and identities and footprints before they can give consent. And so way before they can give consent. So I think about that a lot in terms of the legacy that we're choosing to establish for our children. But not necessarily because it's something happening in our lives, but not necessarily thinking about what the impact is for them in 10 or 13 years when they're maybe creating a social media presence.
There was actually a really
Yeah.
good article
Yeah.
in The Atlantic recently written by an 8th grader who I forgot what it was called, but it was essentially, she thought there were all these rules in her house. And then when she turned 13 and she got to go on Facebook, she looked at her mom's Facebook account, and her mom's Facebook account was just stories about her and pictures of her and things about her. And she was so mad. And it was such a good perspective. Totally look it up. It was a really good perspective.
I believe in Germany or in somewhere in Europe, it's actually disallowed. It's against the law to post it. Yeah. One thing that I wanted to add to that is along the conversation around media literacy and also literacy education, expanding the concept of it is that not only that we understand how media is affecting us and how we should defend against that, but also us as citizens or the youth being aware of what they can do to influence the design and the role that media plays in the commercial world as well.
I think that's one of the things that's been so interesting just in preparing this panel, but also in hearing all of you talk, is the sort of intersecting concepts that are both always co-present at all times, but also need their own attention. So I'll just highlight a few, and that we're sort of talking about things like media literacy as connected to civic engagement, participation, emancipation, rights, justice. We're also talking about the sort of design of media and sort of thinking about inclusion and participation as a way that media gets produced. So thinking about young people in particular, but people in general, as having the opportunity not just to consume, but also contribute to the media landscape. The other thing I think was so interesting that's come up so far are the tensions around, this is a way of both creating context for caring and for engagement and for recognition and belonging that sort of undergirds a lot of what you're saying. And how that happens through opportunities to participate in representation through multiple forms of expression. And I think all of those pieces sort of coexist in different ways in all of the things that you're talking about. I wanted to give the audience a chance to kind of engage with what you've said. And while we do that, and while we take a question, I'm going to put up the poll. If you all remember, this poll down here was an invitation for you to talk about what media literacy means to you. And you can go online and just jot down your responses. And what we're going to do is I'm going to throw up what the answers have been, and that might give some fodder for our conversation too. I believe you wanted to. Please, absolutely.
So, thank you guys for sharing. I mean, I know it's really, it's a very novel topic because there's a lot of disagreement about this. So I have a question. Where is the parent role in all of this? The parents have an active role, I assume, right? So I know that we'd like to bring it to the schools right away, but how can the parents address this?
So I think there's a lot of work being done right now about the concept of a media mentor. So I don't know if you know the work of like the Erickson Institute and Lisa Guernsey at New America, this idea that parents need training and need understanding and how to be a media mentor and to think about their role with media similar to their role with teaching their kids to read. This idea that, we don't just hand a kid a book and say, good luck. We're sitting down, we're helping them decode and looking at symbols and all that. So parents need to play a really important role. I think right now, unfortunately, a lot of the messaging that's getting to parents is all the don'ts and all the fear and all the reasons why things are bad and dangerous and very protectionist. And so I would hope that we're going to get to the point where we have more media literacy conversations with parents rather than just focused on kind of like online safety, digital citizenship. So I think you've asked a really important question, and we at Namely, we've never specifically like targeted the parent group, although we do have a guide, like a downloadable guide, like how to building healthy relationships, so how to have media literacy conversations at home, because we know that the line between school and home is blurred. So I think there's more work that can be done. There are a lot of organizations that are doing good work with parents when it comes to this. So I think it's an ongoing conversation.
I think a lot of responsibility these days get placed on schools, and right away we want to like include these things into our curriculum, which I hear what you're saying, but at the same time, why can't you just teach your kids to make, good choices at home and to develop critical skills, and to sometimes just say no.
Well, I gotta I have a 14 and 16-year-old, and I assure you, if it was that easy, we'd be having a different conversation, because I would argue that I agree that a lot is asked of schools, but I think there is a tremendous amount asked of parents today. Like what I am expected to do with my 16-year-old and what the school expects me to do and what colleges expect me to do, we really put a lot of pressure on parents. So I think the answer is, how do we all work together? That's what I would hope, that we get to a point where, how does the school and the home and those environments work together?
I agree with you. I just don't see this being part of school curriculum.
Oh, wow.
I don't.
Yeah, I really
I know,
respectfully
I
disagree with that.
Yeah.
Do you want to say something? Okay.
Did you want to respond? Or do
Do you want to respond before I go to the next question?
okay.
No? Oh, no?
no, we have another question. So as the trend is now for the affluent, that is moving away from screen time, moving away from the digital, and based on what you said earlier, just about the news is going to be coming, by Twitter. The thought that came in my mind is, are we going to have, as more underrepresented populations have more access to media, are we now going to have this divide similar to the King James Version versus the real Bible, if you will? So are the affluent going to have certain news because they're going to get it from their own circles, and are the now other class going to get it just from the internet, and is it going to be equitable? Is it going to be the same? Are we going to be one society?
I would. I hope so, but it's already. I mean, that's exactly what's happening already, right? The inequity in the systems and where people are getting the news. So, I think that's why this work is so important, right? I think your point about the divide in terms of just the choices that affluent families have to not bring technology in the home, like that is a choice. That's a privilege in itself. Really interesting stuff to talk about when it comes to equity. Go ahead.
Just, I think I would like to address both of your comment in addressing that. I think the parental role in children's news literacy and media literacy has been proven over and over again in research, regardless of the platform and whatnot. It's very important, but the thing is, we can't, as you say, it's an equity issue. We can't expect everybody to be on the same page and have the same access to information and to the literacy. And I think that's where the education becomes a very important role. And that's why I think one of the reasons why we think about equity, we try and systemize this process of media literacy through education, because we can't assume that all parents would have the same access and information and resources to support their children as well. Yes, and knowledge as well. So I think that sort of addresses, yeah.
I think it's also interesting just what you were saying about, I think there was something recently in the news about the Silicon Valley parents, right? The parents who work at Google and Facebook are now instituting like no screen time, all of that. I don't, obviously none of us can know where that's going, but like I do wonder, I mean, I think it's circling back to kind of the initial approach to media literacy in like the early 90s, which was like the super protectionist stance. They had like TV turn off week, it was shield your children, keep them away, don't have this conversation. And I think that kind of circles back. I mean, I think that is where parents are really important in coming in, and schools we could talk about in another conversation in terms of screen time. But I think completely disallowing any type of screen time, I think, is doing a disservice, going back to how Michelle initially started off her, comments at the beginning of the panel, saying to be literate in 2019 and moving forward, we need to be thinking about the multiple modes of communication and platforms that we're engaging in. So I just wonder, is that going to come around where the affluent families maybe think that they're doing this super, forgetting the word, but like noble thing of, taking away all screens, and is that ultimately going to do a disservice? And I think it's also, it's not this digital divide that was such a popular buzzword 10-ish years ago. It's more about like the participation gap that I think is kind of, that this is speaking to. So everybody, general statement, but so many more people have access to information and have some sort of device where they can get information. But going back to what you were saying, in terms of where people are getting their information from, I think is really interesting. But could that maybe be a way in of having more conversations? Are some kids going to be more aware of what's going on because they've got access to some of these spaces and platforms?
I just quickly wanted to plug a resource. If you're interested in a conversation around screen time, Sonia Livingston's group at LSE, the London School of Economics, is doing some really interesting work on this. And they're, of course, doing a lot of, it's $1 million multi-year project on it. But they're also doing a really good job of disseminating it in the press in a very shareable form. So please check that out.
It's always lovely when you have awesome colleagues who are like reading your mind. And the only thing I'll add to that is what Livingstone and her colleagues do is they also remind us that context matters, and that screen time spent, one of the biggest fears with young people's access to technology is that they aren't going to be safe, either emotionally or physically or socio-emotionally. And one of the things I love about that work, and I think that's also represented here, is two things. One is that producing a film for your family involves screen time. That's a really different kind of thing than spending a lot of time, doing something else that we all might differentially think is terrible. The other thing I wanted to, I won't talk about my history of playing violent video games because that's not I really enjoyed them, but that's not the point of this panel. But the other thing I wanted to say also was that when we talk about media literacy, we are talking about media beyond the screen. And I think the kind of tactile and tangible card-based game that Ioana and Yoo Kyung are developing with students here sits alongside the easy access to sort of the world as we think about it via the phones that many people, but not everybody, but many people have access to. So I really appreciate these questions about both for whom, right? Not for whom ought it be, but for whom are we considering and who is kind of getting access to things that should or should not be. But then also, I think your point is also well taken, and I'm thinking about the first question as well, sort of whose responsibility is it, might be put on its head a little bit to consider in what ways are we all responsible and connected to media literacy education in different ways, that a parent might engage in media literacy education in certain ways. I think about this with my 5-year-old, and a lot of it is just being aware of what she is talking about when she comes home. And a teacher might be engaged in media literacy education curricularly, pedagogically. So I think those are a few points to consider. You've been wanting to say something. Please. You are patient. Please go.
To kind of piggyback on what she was saying and also some of the things that you were saying, as you spoke about media literacy, I am, 50-year-old black woman who read Ed.D magazine and all these other things as kind of rituals in my household. And then, of course, as I got older, Black Twitter was, big friend of mine. And now you're creating these opportunities for children to kind of parse literacy or understand. What about the production? Are we getting ready to kind of get a new voice of people by people that is added to the idea of access, of consumerism, and of all the other ways to intake media? Without certain stories being told, I fear that the intake of media for all is going to be all their media is being taken by people who may not be part of all in all ways. Yeah. So how do you kind of prepare media literacy to include not only consumption but also production? And do you see any kind of new ideas coming up in that realm?
One little point I want to make, and then I want to give it over, is people often say just because on Twitter you could have 100 million followers, it doesn't mean you will. And one of the things I take from that is that the platform is only a part of the equation. Everybody who has access to a smartphone now has the ability to make a film. But where does distribution, awareness, audience, screening, circulation come into it, I think is what you're getting at, sort of the power of the structures, the power that's embedded in the structures that distribute, that become aware. And I think that's a really important piece of the conversation.
I would say from a positive...
Not even that. In other words, if you're teaching people how to consume that, are you teaching people how to produce?
Yes,
Yeah,
and that's part of it. That it all goes together. You can't actually truly, like, we've moved on from thinking you can only focus on analyze and evaluate. You must focus also on creation, because that's what they're doing. They're doing that every time they every time they text, every time they take a picture. They're content creators, right? And I would say on a really positive note, there's an extraordinary amount of work in youth media being done in this country that is inspiring, that is just beyond, like, I can think of organizations within our network that are just doing incredible work with teens all over the country to get their stories told, and to make sure that they understand that their stories should be told, and that they have the power to do that. So storytelling is a huge part of media literacy. So what I see is the youth media kind of the growth in that work is really, truly phenomenal. So I feel really optimistic that there's going to be more of that, and couldn't agree. In my experience, those in media literacy agree with you, right? So it's how do we support that?
I definitely want to echo Michelle's very optimistic stance, because as an internet researcher studying youth media, I'm also very optimistic about what I see. I think that often we're surprised, and we shouldn't be surprised. You know, like Lalitha earlier mentioned, March for Our Lives and the Parkland youth. Like, in that moment, the way that it's been framed in the mainstream media, at least, there was this sense of surprise. Wow, they're so astute at using Twitter, and they're so great at making media, and they're so mature, and they're creative, and they're astute, and they make meaningful use of media. So to me, that shouldn't be shrouded in surprise, the way that it's often done in the press, and sometimes in the academic literature too. And I would also say that even beyond production, in these online spaces that I look at, young people are fulfilling so many meaningful roles as peer critics, as sharers and distributors, as mentors. Just to give you a quick example, one of the spaces that I look at is a fan fiction site, Archive of Our Own. It's a whole kind of self-contained publishing empire that lifts up these voices, and a lot of these voices are marginalized voices. It's a space that has been really empowering for LGBTQ youth, for non-white youth, for religious minority youth. And they are not only the creators, but they are the critics, they are the mentors, they are the editors, they are the sharers. They are having all these different hats on at the same time, and they're learning a lot from the process. So I would say I'm also very optimistic.
I was just going to say something, sort of ask a question, I think, that follows from what you were talking about, which is that, educational inequity systemically is reproduced or produced by enfranchisement and disenfranchisement. And one of the things that I think all of your questions bring up is the risk of whether current media will reproduce the same enfranchised and disenfranchised groups. And I guess the question is how do we make sure that it's not just more of the same? And I think Ioana just gave me part of the answer, but that's what one of the things that I'm wrestling with.
I would just say that I would caution us to not assume there are easy answers to these questions, right? Like, we cannot simplify this culture. These are really complicated questions, and they're complicated issues, and we need to be willing to have nuanced, complicated conversations about them that are gonna take some time. And so I always try to, like, there are no simple answers to this, and that's okay. And that we have to kind of roll up our sleeves and work together to figure it out.
So one question I wanted to ask all of you, now that we have you here, I want you to look ahead to, let's say, 18 months from now. 20 months from now. If your efforts have been successful, if your efforts that you're all individually and perhaps collectively engaged in have made an impact, what has changed?
Yeah, I'll start because I'm closest to this very unstable mic. I would just very briefly, I would say what would change is that young people would feel listened to, especially in terms of civic education that includes media literacy, and they would feel that civic education is speaking to them.
18 months, was it supposed to aim at the next presidential election? Is that how is that the timeline we're working with? Well, I guess one thing that I would like to see happen is us being more aware of, not only from the research perspective, but also the citizens and the youth being more aware of what they're doing with their media and how it's affecting them, but also other people, as them being the distributor and the share of the media themselves and the producer.
Educational policy change happens slowly, so what I hope will change in 18 months as a result of our work is that the aspects of media literacy that are already enshrined in state policy, like access to library media specialists in all secondary schools, which is regulation in New York State, and it's a right. So it's a right of all secondary students to have access to that important resource for media literacy education. But in fact, in many schools, that regulation is not enforced because schools don't have adequate funding. So we'll be working to at least make sure that the rights that are currently part of sound basic education, preparation for civic participation, and media literacy are funded and enforced.
Yeah, it's hard for me as a nonprofit leader not to think in terms of funding. So what do I want to see in 18 months? It's a couple more staff members, and instead of 5,000, 5,400 members, I'd like to see, I don't know, what do you think? You want 15,000 maybe? Ioana's on my board now. So it's free. Join today. So I would like to see our community grow. I agree in the sense that, what I want to see is media literacy for all, but that's not happening in 18 months, let's be honest. So, but the more we build our community, the more we build our partnerships, the more we'll be on that path.
I think at a macro level, I'm going to echo what Ioana was just saying. I would love for us to be less surprised by young people voicing their opinions and being in community with one another, and kind of putting out calls to action in response to social injustices, etc. So I hope we're less surprised about that as a society. And on a more micro level, I hope to have, to be doing some research with young people around their Instagram use, and hope that that's written and published in 18 months. I'm putting it out into the universe. You heard it here. Check me on it.
So, first of all, I want to thank all of you. I want to thank all of you for being here and for your questions. And thank you for participating in this word cloud. What we're going to do is we're going to make all of this available. If you go to masklab.org, you'll see the first blog post will be about this, and it already has some resources, and some of the ones that came up today will also be shared. While I put up this last slide, I wanted to just invite you all to do a couple of things, right? And it really comes from my personal love of Mr. Rogers, and it comes also from a kids show that I used to love when I was a kid, called Kids Are People Too. And I watched a lot of television, and I made a job out of watching television, and so that's my greatest accomplishment. And I think one of the things that I've realized as I've gotten older is that I want to drop the two, that kids are people. And I think what that has allowed, and what this conversation has reinforced, is that there isn't a single audience for the work that we do, which makes it harder. But that while we are addressing different constituents who contribute to the well-being not only of individuals, but of the democracy that we inhabit, that we need to pull all the levers that we can. And some of that is at home, some of that is at school, some of that is at libraries, in our community centers, in our universities and colleges. And I also think that there's real opportunities to build coalition. And I think you have 5 people here represented who are engaged in really thoughtful work, but also networks. And I wanted to sort of just invite you to follow them and be involved with their work, and to continue to be thinking about these questions, and we hope we see you next year.
Can I just say that we have our national conference. We have it every 2 years, and the next one is June 26th to the 28th in Washington, D.C. We're going to be at American University, and we're also going to be at the museum. And for those of you who don't know, the museum is closing at the end of this year. They're closing the actual museum part of it, not the Ed program. So it's actually one of the last opportunities to be at the museum for the day in a learning environment. So please consider joining us.
All right, thank you for joining us for this session.